January the 27th, 1944. Leningrad. 11:17 a.m. Anna Petrova heard the rumble before she understood what it meant. Her hands, skeletal and trembling, had been scraping frost from the inside of her apartment window, a daily ritual that yielded nothing but the same grey vista of rubble and ice. But now the sound grew louder, not artillery, something different, something moving. She pressed her face to the glass, breath fogging the pain she'd just cleared. Down Nevsky Prospect, a convoy was crawling forward through the snow. Trucks. Soviet trucks with red stars painted on their sides, engines coughing black exhaust into the frozen air. Anna's daughter, Katya, 12 years old but looking 8, appeared at her elbow. "Mama!" The word came out as a whisper because neither of them could afford to hope. Hope burned calories. Hope killed you faster than despair. But the trucks kept coming. Anna's legs gave out. She sank to the floor, still gripping the windowsill, and began to sob. Not the quiet, efficient tears of grief that Leningraders had perfected over 900 days of starvation and bombardment, but raw, ugly, gasping sobs that shook her emaciated frame. Outside, neighbors emerged from doorways like phantoms. Some fell to their knees in the street, others stood motionless, unable to process what they were seeing. An old man with a cane raised one arm toward the convoy and shouted something unintelligible, his voice cracking from disuse and emotion. The first truck slowed to a stop. A soldier jumped down from the cab, boots crunching in the snow. He looked at the gathered crowd, at their sunken eyes and skeletal limbs and the strange, desperate silence that hung over them, and his own face crumbled. "You're alive," he said. "My God, you're alive." The siege of Leningrad had lasted 82 days. It had killed more than 1 million civilians through starvation, disease, and relentless German artillery fire. It had reduced one of the Soviet Union's most beautiful cities to a frozen necropolis, where the dead were stacked like cordwood in the streets, and parents made unspeakable choices to keep their children breathing one more day. And now, on this bitter January morning, it was over. But what the survivors said, what they whispered and screamed and sobbed, would reveal something far more complex than simple relief. To understand what broke that day, you have to understand what had been built. Leningrad in June 1941 was a city of grandeur and contradiction. Its neoclassical facades and wide boulevards spoke of imperial ambition, while its factories and shipyards hummed with Soviet industrial might. 3 million people lived there. Artists, engineers, workers, party officials, families who'd known nothing but this city's rhythms for generations. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, the Wehrmacht's Army Group North had explicit orders: Leningrad must be erased from the earth, not captured. Erased. Hitler's directive was clear. No German soldier would accept the city's surrender. It would be starved, bombed, and obliterated. By September 8, 1941, German forces had encircled the city. The ring closed with mechanical precision, railways severed, roads blocked. The only supply route left was across Lake Ladoga, and even that was under constant aerial bombardment. Stalin's orders were equally unambiguous. Leningrad would not be abandoned. Defense Commissar Marshal Kliment Voroshilov was replaced by General Georgy Zhukov, who arrived on September the 9th with instructions to hold at all costs. Zhukov walked through the city's defensive positions with his jaw set and his hands clasped behind his back, absorbing the mathematics of catastrophe. 3 million civilians, food reserves for 30 days, winter approaching. In the Smolny Institute, once a school for noble women, now the Communist Party headquarters, Zhdanov, the city's party boss, sat in a high-backed chair that made him look smaller than he was. His face was flushed, his collar damp with sweat despite the autumn chill. Across from him, military planners spread maps across a mahogany table. "The Germans won't attack," one officer said. "They're going to wait." "Wait for what?" Zhdanov snapped. "For winter, for us to eat ourselves." The room went silent, because everyone knew it was true. Rationing began immediately, but the numbers told their own story. By November, bread rations had been cut to 250 grams per day for workers, 125 grams for dependents and children. A child's daily ration, about 2 slices of bread, made from sawdust, cellulose, and whatever flour could be scraped together. Protein had become a memory. Vegetables didn't exist. Fuel for heating ran out by December. The Leningrad winter of 1941-42 killed faster than bullets. Temperatures plunged to 30 degrees C, people collapsed in bread lines and froze to death before anyone could carry them away. Entire families went to sleep in their apartments and never woke up. The Hermitage Museum, one of the world's great cultural repositories, became a shelter where curators starved while protecting Rembrandt and Raphael from German bombs. Dmitri Shostakovich, the composer, had fled the city, but not before writing his 7th symphony, later known as the Leningrad Symphony, a work of defiance that would be performed inside the besieged city by an orchestra of skeletal musicians in August 1942. And through it all, the German artillery never stopped. Shells fell on hospitals, schools, apartment blocks. The Germans had mapped the city's geography with bureaucratic precision, targeting areas where civilians gathered. Every day at 11 a.m. and 5 p.m., the shelling intensified, a schedule so predictable that Leningraders learned to time their movements around it. But what the Germans couldn't understand, what would eventually doom their strategy, was that starvation didn't break Leningrad, it forged it into something harder. January 18th, 1940, 7 days before the full lifting of the siege, the Red Army's Leningrad and Volkhov fronts launched Operation January Thunder. Marshal Leonid Govorov, commanding from a bunker south of the city, had spent months preparing this offensive with obsessive precision. Artillery positions calculated, supply lines secured, tank divisions hidden in forests. At 9:35 a.m., Soviet artillery opened up along a 120-kilometer front. The barrage was apocalyptic, thousands of guns firing simultaneously, turning the frozen landscape into a moonscape of smoke and flame. German defensive positions, fortified over 2 years, disintegrated under the onslaught. In Leningrad itself, civilians heard the guns and knew what it meant, but they didn't celebrate, not yet. They'd heard promises before. Vera Inba, a poet who'd kept a diary throughout the siege, stood at her apartment window and wrote, "The sound is different this time. Not defensive, not desperate. This is attack." The Red Army advanced with grim efficiency. Krasnoselo fell on January 19th. Magar was liberated on January 21st. The German 18th Army, under General Georg Lindemann, tried to establish new defensive lines, but found itself outflanked and outgunned. Hitler's orders to hold were ignored by field commanders who could see the mathematics of destruction. By January 23rd, Soviet forces had pushed the Germans back 60 to 100 kilometers from the city. The artillery bombardment, the daily terror that had defined life in Leningrad for 872 days, stopped. Inside the city, the silence was unbearable. Olga Bergholz, another poet and radio broadcaster who had become the voice of Leningrad's suffering, spoke into her microphone that evening. "Citizens, the guns have stopped. Do you hear? They have stopped." But even then, people waited, because nothing was certain until the supply convoys arrived. January 27th, 1944, dawn. The first trucks left the railhead at Volkhov before first light. Soviet logistics officers had organized 27 vehicles loaded with bread, grain, potatoes, canned meat, and medical supplies. The convoy commander, a colonel named Petrov, stood beside the lead truck and checked his watch every 30 seconds. His orders were simple: reach Leningrad before noon. The road, really just packed snow over frozen mud, had been cleared by military engineers working through the night. Along the route, soldiers stood at intervals, ensuring the path remained open. Some of them wept as the trucks passed. In Leningrad, word spread through informal networks, whispers in bread lines, messages passed between apartments. "The trucks are coming from the mainland, real food." At 10:47 a.m., forward observers stationed on the city's outskirts radioed confirmation. Convoy in sight. Anna Petrova, who'd spent the morning scraping frost from her window, saw them first from her apartment on Nevsky Prospect. The rumble of engines, the red stars, the impossible sight of Soviet trucks moving freely without fear of bombardment. She collapsed. Others poured into the streets. By the time the convoy reached Moskovsky Station at 11:15 a.m., thousands had gathered despite their weakness. The square looked like a scene from a fever dream. Skeletal figures in torn coats and wrapped blankets, moving slowly through the snow, their faces a mixture of disbelief and desperate hope. The first truck stopped. The driver climbed down. He was a young sergeant from Siberia, well-fed and healthy, and when he saw the crowd, he froze. "Comrades," he started, but his voice broke. An old woman pushed forward. Her name was Maria Nikolaevna, and she'd been a schoolteacher before the war. Now she weighed perhaps 40 kilograms. She reached out and touched the truck's metal side, as if checking whether it was real. "Is it food?" she asked. The sergeant nodded, unable to speak. Maria turned to the crowd and said very quietly, "It's food." The sound that rose from the crowd wasn't quite a cheer. It was something more primal, a collective exhalation of grief and relief that had been held in for 872 days. People began to weep openly. Men who'd survived Stalingrad broke down. Women clutched each other. A teenage boy fell to his knees and pressed his forehead into the snow. But what they said, the actual words spoken in those first moments, revealed the complexity of survival. "My son didn't make it," one woman said to no one in particular. "He died in November. He would have been 16. "Where were you?" a man shouted at the soldiers unloading supplies. "Where were you in 42? Another voice, trembling, Thank you, God, thank you. And from somewhere in the crowd, we held, we held. The distribution of supplies was chaotic at first. Soviet officials tried to maintain order, but the crowd surged forward with desperate skeletal energy. Military police formed a cordon. An officer with a megaphone called for calm, but his voice was drowned out. Then an old man, a veteran of the First World War, recognizable by the faded imperial medals he still wore, raised his walking stick and shouted, "Comrades, we are still Leningraders. We will not become animals now." The crowd stilled. Slowly, painfully, a line formed. The first ration was 300 grams of bread per person. Real bread, not the sawdust mixture they'd been eating. People held the portions like sacred objects. Some ate immediately, tearing into the bread with their teeth. Others carefully wrapped their portions and tucked them away, unable to trust that more would come. A young mother named Svetlana received her ration and immediately broke it in half. She ate one piece and saved the other for her daughter at home, a 4-year-old named Tanya, who'd been too weak to walk to the distribution point. As Svetlana turned to leave, she passed a journalist, one of the few who'd remained in the city throughout the siege. He was recording testimonials. "What do you want to say?" he asked. Svetlana looked at him with hollow eyes. "I want to say that we're still here. That's all. We're still here." At the Smolny Institute, Andrei Zhdanov received the report at 12:30 p.m. The convoy had arrived. Distribution was underway. The railroad line was open. He sat very still for several minutes, staring at the map on his wall, the map that had shown the German encirclement for 2.5 years. Then he stood, walked to his window, and looked out at the city he'd helped to keep alive. His secretary found him there 20 minutes later, standing motionless, tears running down his face. In Berlin, the news reached OKW headquarters by 2:00 p.m. The report was clinical. Soviet forces had broken the Leningrad blockade. The city could not be starved into submission. Army Group North was in full retreat. Hitler, in a meeting with his generals, erupted. "Leningrad was to be erased," he screamed. "The city should not exist." But it did exist, and it had won. In Moscow, Stalin received confirmation from Marshal Govorov at 3:15 p.m. His response was characteristically terse. "Good. Continue the offensive." But privately, Stalin understood what Leningrad meant. The city had become a symbol, not just of Soviet resistance, but of something deeper. It had suffered more than any city in human history and refused to break. Yet the psychological toll was incalculable. Dr. Elena Kordzun, one of the few physicians who'd survived the siege, returned to work at Hospital Number 17 that afternoon. The wards were filled with people in various stages of dystrophy, a clinical term that meant they were starving to death. Now, with food arriving, she faced a new crisis: refeeding syndrome. People who ate too much too quickly would die from the shock to their systems. She moved through the wards, explaining carefully, "Small portions, slowly. Your body needs time." But some couldn't wait. A man in his 50s, a factory worker named Grigory, had received his bread ration and eaten it all at once. By evening, his heart had stopped. Elena sat beside his bed, exhausted beyond measure, and thought, "We survived the siege, but the siege hasn't finished with us." Across the city, reactions multiplied. In the Hermitage, the curators who'd protected the museum's treasures emerged from the basement. They walked through the galleries, now mostly empty, the art having been evacuated, and allowed themselves for the first time to believe they'd succeeded. In the ruins of the Kirov factory, workers who'd manufactured tanks and shells throughout the siege gathered outside. Someone had brought a bottle of vodka, hidden for this moment, and they passed it around in silence, each taking a small sip. In the Piskarovskoye cemetery, where 500,000 siege victims lay in mass graves, a woman named Irina stood in the snow. Her husband and 2 sons were buried there. She didn't know exactly where, because the dead had been buried in their thousands without markers or ceremony. She'd brought a piece of bread from her ration. She broke it into 3 portions and placed them on the snow. "It's over," she whispered. "You can rest now." But the most revealing moments came in private conversations. Fragments overheard, recorded in diaries, preserved in testimonies collected later. A teenage girl to her mother, "Can we eat like this every day now?" A man to his neighbor, "I stole bread from my brother in December. He died in January. How do I live with that?" A woman simply, "I forgot what potatoes taste like." And from an old man sitting on a frozen bench, speaking to no one, "We won, but what did we win? Look at us, look at what we've become." The liberation of Leningrad revealed uncomfortable truths about survival under extreme conditions. The siege had killed over 1 million civilians, more than the total British and American losses in the entire war. It had reduced a modern city to a pre-industrial state where people burned furniture for warmth and ate wallpaper paste for the calories in the glue. But it had also exposed the limits of Nazi ideology. Hitler had believed that Slavic peoples, Untermenschen in Nazi racial theory, would collapse under pressure. That Soviet society, held together by terror, would fragment when tested. Leningrad proved him catastrophically wrong. The city's survival had been built on several pillars. First, Soviet propaganda and party control maintained a framework of collective purpose, even as that framework frayed under starvation. Second, the Red Army's defense of the perimeter, especially during the brutal winter of 1941-42, had prevented a German breakthrough. Third, the improvised Road of Life across frozen Lake Ladoga, a supply route that functioned only in winter when the ice was thick enough to support trucks, had delivered just enough food to keep the city from total collapse. But beneath these structural factors was something more fundamental. Leningraders had made a collective choice to endure rather than surrender. This wasn't romantic, it was brutal calculation. Many who survived did so by committing acts they would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. The siege broke social bonds, turned neighbors into strangers, and forced people into moral territories where normal ethics ceased to function. There were documented cases of cannibalism. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, had entire departments devoted to investigating these crimes. Olga Bergholz in her diary wrote, "We do not speak of it, we cannot speak of it, but we know," yet the city held. Military analysts would later debate why. Some pointed to Soviet political control, the party's ability to suppress dissent, and maintain order through fear. Others emphasized Russian patriotism and the deep cultural identification with Leningrad as a symbol of Russian civilization. Still others noted that surrender to the Germans was not a genuine option. Hitler's orders meant that capitulation would lead not to survival but to systematic extermination. The truth was probably all of these and none of them, because individual survival is always more complicated than collective narratives. Anna Petrova, who'd collapsed at her window when the trucks arrived, had survived by working in a factory that produced artillery shells. The extra rations for munitions workers, an additional 100 grams of bread per day, had kept her and her daughter alive. But to get that job, she'd needed party approval. And to get party approval, she'd informed on a neighbor who'd made defeatist statements. That neighbor had been arrested and never returned. Anna knew this. She would always know this. And when the bread arrived on January the 27th, her tears were not purely tears of joy. By evening, the city had transformed. Not physically, Leningrad was still a landscape of ruins and frozen bodies and gutted buildings, but psychologically a shift had occurred. The siege, which had become the defining reality of existence, was now in the past tense. Radio Leningrad, which had broadcast throughout the siege, played Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony. The performance was scratchy, recorded months earlier, but it didn't matter. People stood in their apartments and listened, and some of them remembered attending concerts before the war, when music was entertainment rather than defiance. In Smolny, Zhdanov composed a telegram to Stalin. "The blockade is broken, Leningrad is free, long live the Red Army, long live the Soviet Union." Stalin's response arrived within hours. "Well done, continue operations to liberate the entire region." No mention of the million dead. No acknowledgement of what the city had endured, just orders to continue. Zhdanov read the telegram and felt something inside him crack. He'd presided over catastrophe, enforced brutal rationing decisions, and sent internal NKVD reports to Moscow documenting the city's collapse. He'd done his duty, but at what cost? He poured himself a glass of vodka, real vodka, not the industrial alcohol that had become currency during the siege, and drank it alone in his office. In the streets, people were still gathering, not in celebration, but in something quieter. Small groups formed outside buildings in courtyards near the frozen canals. They didn't speak much. They just stood together, breathing, existing, bearing witness to their own survival. A schoolteacher named Konstantin Mikhailov walked to the Neva River and stood on the embankment. The river was still frozen solid, as it had been when people hauled water from ice holes because the city's pipes had burst. He looked across toward the Peter and Paul fortress, barely visible in the winter twilight, and thought about his wife. She died in February 1942. Dystrophy, the clinical term for starvation. One morning she'd simply been too weak to get out of bed. By afternoon, she was gone. He'd wrapped her body in a sheet and pulled her on a sled to the cemetery because there were no coffins and no vehicles. He'd left her in a pile with hundreds of others because there were no grave diggers. Only mass graves dug by explosives when the ground was too frozen for shovels. And now the siege was over, and she wasn't here to see it. Konstantin stood on the embankment for a long time, until the cold became unbearable, and then he walked home. The final truth about Leningrad was this. survival created its own moral complexity. Those who endured had made compromises. Some had stolen, some had betrayed, some had simply been lucky. They'd had connections or skills or physical resilience that others lacked. And everyone who survived carried the knowledge that others, often better people, had not. This would haunt the city for generations. In the years after the war, Leningrad veterans, both military and civilian, would be identified by a special medal for the defense of Leningrad. They wore it with pride, but they rarely spoke about what they'd experienced, because speaking meant remembering, and remembering was unbearable. Tanya Savicheva, an 11-year-old girl who'd kept a diary during the siege, had written 9 brief entries, each recording a family member's death. Zhenya died, Grandma died, Leka died, Uncle Vasya died, Uncle Lesha died, Mama died, the Savichevs died, everyone died. Only Tanya is left. She'd been evacuated in 1942, but died of illness in 1944. Her diary became one of the siege's most powerful documents, displayed at the Nuremberg trials as evidence of Nazi war crimes. But Tanya's story was only one among millions. What Soviet civilians said when 900 days of siege finally broke was not a single narrative. It was a chorus of contradictory voices, relief and rage, gratitude and grief, pride and shame. They said, "We survived." They said, "Why did it take so long?" They said, "My family is gone." They said, "We are Leningraders." And in saying these things, they revealed what survival under extreme conditions actually means. Not triumph, but endurance. Not heroism, but the grinding, unglamorous choice to keep living when every rational reason to give up has been exhausted. The trucks kept coming through February and March. The railroad brought more supplies. The artillery stopped permanently. Life, in some distorted form, resumed. But the city carried its scars. April 1944, Leningrad, late afternoon. Anna Petrova sat at her kitchen table with her daughter, Katya. They'd just finished a meal, real potatoes, a small piece of salted fish, black bread. It was more food than they'd seen at one time in 2 years. Katya ate slowly, savoring each bite. She'd learned, as all Leningraders had, never to waste anything. "Mama," she said, "when will things be normal?" Anna looked at her daughter, at her thin arms and the hollows under her eyes, at the old woman's face on a 12-year-old child. "I don't know," Anna said. Outside, the spring thaw had begun. The ice on the Neva was breaking up. Water flowed again. And in the cemetery at Piskarovskoye, workers had begun the impossible task of marking graves, recording names, trying to impose order on catastrophe. Anna didn't tell her daughter about the neighbor she'd betrayed. She would carry that alone. But she did say this: "We're still here, Katya. That's what matters. We're still here." And in the fading afternoon light, with the sound of the city slowly coming back to life outside their window, mother and daughter sat together in silence, survivors of something that should have been impossible to survive, bearing witness to their own existence. The siege was over, but its shadows would never fully lift.